Hello, my name's Ed Yong, and it is my honor to speak to you at the first International Conference on Clinical Scientific Advances in MECFS and Long COVID. Now, I am not an expert on these conditions. I'm not a clinician. I am not someone who has either of these conditions, but I am a journalist who has reported on both long COVID and MECFS for the last few years. And I'm here to share what I've learned in learning more about these kinds of illnesses and my approach to telling stories about them. So, in the early months of the COVID-19 pandemic, when many people who are now still sick were first infected, the common wisdom was that the coronavirus either sent you to an intensive care unit or, more commonly, caused mild symptoms that resolved after just 2 weeks. But in the late spring, I started seeing trends that did not fit with this narrative. My sister-in-law got infected in March 2020, and she was still burning with fever after 3 weeks, and then 6, and then more. Young and formerly healthy people like Fiona Lowenstein and Mara Gay wrote op-eds about surviving but not recovering. Felicity Callard wrote an amazing piece in the blog called Somatosphere about what mild cases can really be like. But when I interviewed scientists and clinicians about these lingering symptoms in May, most were surprised. One said, "That's unusual." But it wasn't. By May, affected patients had already formed support groups thousands strong. They had coined terms like long COVID and long hauler. The Patient Led Research Collaborative, or PLRC, had even conducted research on their own communities. And even in March, people with similar illnesses like MECFS were warning that this new pathogen would trigger a wave of disability such as what they had long experienced. They knew then what is now abundantly clear. People with infected by COVID can be pummeled by months or years of debilitating symptoms, and the same is true for a variety of viral illnesses. I wrote my first piece about long COVID in June 2020. It was one of the first pieces about the condition to appear in a national publication. And in the following days, that story was read by more than 1 million people. I got more than 150 emails from people who thought that they were going mad or had been told that they were going mad. And they felt validated to see their reality, which was so different to the accepted reality of the illness, reflected in a big story. And that story was the first of 8, and those responses were the first of thousands more. That work, published in a major national magazine, The Atlantic, helped to catapult long COVID into the limelight. It helped to turn long hauler into a common phrase. And it helped to draw the connection between long COVID and MECFS, a connection that I'm proud to say that I made from the very first time I wrote about long COVID. Now, I stress that I would not have covered this topic in the way that had in the way that I did, had it not been for people like Fiona Lowenstein and Mara Gay and Felicity Callard and the PLRC, patients talking about their experiences and advocating for themselves. And the same especially goes for a woman named Sarah Ramey. So Sarah and I first got to know each other in 2018 when she sent me an email out of the blue. We had communicated exactly once before on Twitter. She liked my book. I loved her music. Her email said, "I have a serious health condition. I'm moving to DC, where I lived at the time. All the people I know recently moved away, and this is absolutely mortifying, but will you go on a friend date with me?" I said yes, and we almost immediately became good friends. I'm recording this having just visited Sarah in Arizona, where she lives. In 2019, Sarah sent me a copy of the book that she had been working on for a decade. It's called The Lady's Handbook for Her Mysterious Illness, which describes her experience with MECFS and complex regional pain syndrome, the shocking mistreatment that she experienced as a result, and the similar problems that millions of other people go through. The book is a monumental feat of storytelling. Again, it's The Lady's Handbook for Her Mysterious Illness. If you've not read it, I highly recommend it. And I know that the book has made its way out through this community, but maybe a lot of people haven't heard about it because it had the massive misfortune to come out in the middle of March 2020, which meant that it got zero publicity, which is really the most bitter irony for a book about neglected diseases. But I read it, and it helped me understand my friend better. It opened my eyes to this entire category of medical problems. I read about how crushingly hard it was for Sarah to get medical care. I read about how her symptoms were relentlessly downplayed or ignored by medical professionals and by her loved ones. I read about how the people who she sought for help caused her emotional and physical harm, how impossible it was for her to rely on evidence based medicine when medicine doesn't bother to create an evidence base for your condition. Her book changed the way I think about the relationship between patients and the healthcare system, and what it means to think about health critically and skeptically. Perhaps most importantly, I got to see what it is like for someone to live with this condition, a condition that debilitates Sarah regularly, but that allows her these brief windows of opportunity where she can hang out with her able bodied friends like myself. And in those windows, she seems fine. But I know that she's not fine because I've talked to her and I listened. That book primed me for what was to come. It meant that once I started hearing about similar things in long COVID, I knew what I was looking at and I knew to draw a link with MECFS. Covering these conditions has solidified my view that science is not the objective neutral force that it is often caricatured to be. It is instead a human endeavour, relentlessly buffeted by our culture, values, and politics. As energy depleting illnesses that disproportionately affect women, long COVID and MECFS are easily belittled by a sexist society that trivializes women's pain, and a capitalist one that values people according to their productivity. Societal dismissal then leads to scientific neglect, and the lack of research then becomes fodder for further skepticism. I only understood this vicious cycle after interviewing social scientists, disability scholars, and patients themselves, whose voices are often absent or minimized in the media in favor of the same academics and clinicians who, when I started reporting on these conditions, knew the least about them. It is important to realize that, like the pandemic as a whole, long COVID and MECFS are not just health problems, they are social ones, and they can only be fully understood as social problems. So, the dismissal and the gaslighting that patients with these conditions that my friend have experienced, people saying you're just depressed, you're anxious, it is in your head. These are among the worst aspects of long COVID and MECFS, and they can be as crushing as the physical suffering. They are really hard to fight because the disease's symptoms can be so beyond the realm of everyday experience as to seem unbelievable, and because those same symptoms sap people's energy and fog their mental abilities. So, journalism can be a conduit for empathy, helps to put words to the indescribable and clarify the unfathomable for people too sick to do it themselves. Long haulers have told me that through these pieces, they better understood what was happening to them. They found community and medical care. And they felt the relief of recognition at a time when friends, family members, and healthcare professionals were brushing off their ordeal as imaginary. As a science writer, I have written about many topics throughout my career, but none have affected me more than long COVID, and none have so profoundly changed my view about what journalism can achieve and how it can do that. Many long haulers, and I use that term expansively to include people with MECFS, long COVID, and other sister illnesses like fibromyalgia and Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, and many more. These groups of people have told me that they have used my work to finally get through to skeptical loved ones, to employers, to doctors. And I hadn't not ever thought that that would be how the pieces would be used. I used to imagine that my writing would go out to a reader who might learn something new, maybe even change what and how they think, and then that's it. But this one step model is woefully incomplete because we are a social species. Journalism doesn't stop with first generation readers, it cascades through their networks. And done well, it can make those networks stronger. After my most recent piece, which explained how severe the fatigue of long COVID and MECFS really is, one long hauler told me that her sister said, I did not understand how sick you really felt. Even healthy people started writing in. A reader who spent her 25-year life watching her mother wrestling with MECFS said that until reading that piece, quote, I truly didn't get it, or maybe I just didn't believe her. People who had been sick for years or even decades said it was the first time they had seen their lives accurately, fully, and compassionately reflected in the press. This is a damning indictment of our profession, and I'm including my pre pandemic self in that. I am far from the only journalist covering this topic, but there are clearly not enough of us. How could so many people feel so thoroughly unrepresented by an industry that is supposed to give voice to the voiceless? In covering diseases like long COVID and MECFS, many of our journalistic norms and biases work against us. We love iconoclasts, but that privileges the voices of skeptics who can claim that they are being cancelled by patient groups over the voices of the patients who are actually suffering. We love new, novel things, but that leaves us prone to ignoring chronic conditions that are, by definition, not new. We work to things like tight deadlines. We prefer phone interviews to print, but these things can be harmful to the people we most need to hear from. We cannot afford these weaknesses. Around the world, tens of millions of people are suffering from long COVID. Some might recover, others will join them, but others will join them, especially since our leaders have rushed us back to an era of unrestrained airborne pathogens and lax public health, an era that had already cost millions of MECFS sufferers dearly long before COVID arrived. In this status quo, people are expected to ignore the threat of infection. And then they'll pay through the nose if they get sick, or at least here in the US, and they'll face stigma and ridicule if they become disabled. That is a horrendous bargain. Journalism can and should repudiate it. We are not neutral actors reporting on the world at a distance. We create that world through our choices, and we must learn to choose better with purpose, care, and compassion. So I choose my stories very carefully. I prefer to be proactive over reactive. There are a lot of skeptics of MECFS on long COVID. And I think if we spend all our time countering what they are saying without talking about the realities of these conditions for ourselves, we lose something. We lose a lot by letting extremists dictate the terms of condition, of the terms of engagement. So rather than rebut a dozen rubbish op-eds, I prefer to spend my time actually creating work that will help people, that will illuminate rather than counter-illuminate. I try to pick angles that will be interesting to both people with the conditions and people without them. So the pieces that I've written about the reality of symptoms like fatigue and brain fog were like this. They were like biographies of symptoms. I wanted those pieces to make people who experience these symptoms feel seen, but also to convey to everyone else just how strange and extreme those symptoms can be. After choosing my stories, I then have to interview people. But I recognize that for this topic, interviews have costs. Interviewing long haulers isn't benign. At minimum, I might be asking them to relive the worst experiences of their lives to a stranger. But worse, most long haulers experience post exertional malaise, PEM, in which minor physical or mental exertion can trigger a loss of energy so profound that I have called it the annihilation of possibility. An hour-long call could wreck someone for days. And knowing this, I've started telling people up front that they could end and reschedule the interview at the slightest inkling that their health might suffer. And some did pull on that ripcord. I set long deadlines, knowing that I was working on what disability scholars have called trip time, a flexible way of scheduling your time that's responsive to the needs of your illness. While I would normally insist that phone interviews get better results, I've also happily sent written questions to long haulers who struggle with real-time spoken conversations. I know that my normal deadlines will go out the window. I make my schedule work around my interviewees' energy levels and not the other way round. Good journalists are meant to maintain a healthy distance from our sources. But this professional standard can easily transform into callousness. Staying independent turns into I act how I want to act and you deal with it. But with long COVID, I bend to accommodate my source's need and not the other way around. I also bring as much curiosity and empathy as I can to interviews. I am not fishing for quotes or for dramatic details of horrible symptoms. I want to know how long haulers feel. I want to know the nuances and the minutiae of their lives. I want to check my own thoughts on the fly. I run my interpretations past my sources in real time to check if my understanding and assumptions are correct. You told me this, it makes me think blah, blah, blah. Am I correct in that? And I do this iteratively, asking each source about the experiences of the previous ones. The last person I spoke to told me this. Does that match your experience? Do you agree with that? That allows me to identify points of commonality or contention. I know that everyone is wrong about something, and being empathetic doesn't mean abandoning our journalistic rigor. It just means going about establishing that rigor in a different way. I listen. I listen very, very carefully. I am trying to look for places where my own understanding shifts in the middle of a conversation. For example, long haulers often suffer fatigue, but that fatigue is very different from everyday tiredness. It is more severe, it is multifaceted, it is harder to push through, and it is not cured by sleep. Post-exertional malaise, PEM, is different again. Every symptom burns more fiercely. The fatigue is accompanied by a flu-like poisoned feeling. And it's not that your batteries are drained, but they're completely missing. These states are very easy to conflate. It is easy to think that PEM is just extreme fatigue or that a long hauler's fatigue is like my fatigue. They are not. And their differences only became clear to me after many interviews and a lot of careful listening. It is very easy to talk to people and simply think, well, they're all exhausted, that's bad. But there are subtleties and nuances in their metaphors and their language and their descriptions that reveal important truths about the disease to anyone who cares to listen. I have tried to center patients. I don't use them in anecdotal leads, only to quote academics thereafter. They might be suffering, but they are still protagonists of their own story, with power and agency. They are not just passive beneficiaries of medical aid. I want people to empathize with long haulers, not gawk at them. There are good moral reasons to do that, but there are good practical reasons too. Biologists have a saying that nothing about biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. That phrase is about the central position of evolutionary theory in understanding the natural world. Or by analogy, nothing in chronic illness makes sense except in the light of the patient experience. That experience is the ground truth against which all other data must be understood. If you read a scientific paper that contradicts what the patients are telling you, it's not that the patients are wrong. It's likely that the study has flaws in it. This patient centric approach is sometimes dismissed as advocacy. And there's a feeling that advocacy is antithetical to journalism, that the two are opposed to each other. But in fact, it's just good journalistic practice to give weight to the most knowledgeable sources. I have treated long haulers as the experts on their own conditions because they are. They saw and predicted the rise of long COVID before credentialed academics did. Many are patient experts who have read the scientific literature on long COVID and MECFS more deeply than many doctors because they are highly motivated to do so. Others are meta experts. They thoroughly understand the community, their desires, their needs, their history, and conflicts. They can help you distinguish who are the reliable voices and who are the grifters who are in it for their own personal gain. All of these people should be front and center of every story. And instead, a lot of journalists just use them as anecdotal fodder. You lead your story with someone who's suffering and then you leave them behind. No, they should be the core of what we write. Now, I didn't come to this easily. Before the pandemic, I mostly interviewed academics who had degrees and institutional affiliations. But long COVID taught me to seek expertise where it actually lies instead of where it seems to lie. And this is now especially easy to do because there are large databases of sources of good long haulers to talk to, which have been compiled by other researchers and journalists. When I write about long COVID, I write in part to make people feel seen, to create this combined mirror that reflects countless individual experiences. These illnesses are usually extremely varied, but if I can do my job right, I can make everyone feel at least partly reflected. But I also write for people who don't have the conditions themselves, in the hope that they will learn something. Writing is a constant battle for attention, one waged through careful consideration of structure, tone, and understanding where readers are at. And so, with things like MECFS, I always have at the back of my mind the most common misconceptions. When I wrote a piece about fatigue, I started with a description of what someone who has MECFS experiences, and then immediately I compare that to her previous life to note that the fatigue she now feels is nothing like what she once felt. That's meant to address the, oh, I'm just tired too, rejoinder, without having to explicitly do that. My point here, you can hear my dog walking along the floor. My point here is that if you want a healthy person to care about or to empathize with people with MECFS, it is not enough to simply say that this condition is terrible or debilitating. You have to show, not tell. And particularly, you have to show how it is different to normal experience. You have to understand and acknowledge that it is very hard to appreciate what this condition is like when you are healthy. You have to get through to people who might be skeptically thinking, well, that doesn't sound like, so that doesn't sound real, or that sounds too similar to what I have, and actually nip those thoughts in the bud in the course of a piece in a very seamless way. Similarly, I think it's not enough to say that there are just differences, that these diseases are not common to our normal experience. You have to try to explain at least some of the scientific underpinnings for those differences, and I have tried to do that. It is a very easy frame to say that these are mystery illnesses about which nothing is known. But that frame only serves people who are skeptical about them. It certainly doesn't serve long haulers themselves, and it simply isn't true. There might be not enough research on these conditions, but there is some, and it is valuable. It has given us important insights that readers need to know about. These are the skills that I've worked hard to build over the years in many topics, and I've brought to bear in the reporting for this one. After the pieces are finished, the work still continues. So in several of my recent pieces, I recorded audio versions because people commonly tell me that their brain fog makes it hard to read long pieces. After these pieces are published, I get a lot of emails, several hundred after some of the more popular ones, and I try and read and respond to all as many of them as I can, because I know that writing these emails exerts the cost, and I try to honor that by at least reading them. Now, I have not been trained in any of this, right? I don't have a background in trauma-informed reporting. I didn't even know what the term meant until quite recently. I still make mistakes, and I'm still learning how to do this. But for those of you who are in the room and who want to write more about these conditions, and I really hope that you do, I want to emphasize that the tent poles are curiosity, kindness, and empathy, and everything else unfolds from that. Writing about the pandemic has been very difficult. Many of the grim outcomes I warned about came to pass. Most of the changes that I hoped for did not. I watched two administrations in the US make avoidable mistakes and then make them again and again with every new surge and variant. I watched almost every publication that I once cared about become complicit in normalizing a level of death and disability that was once described as incalculable. That work was really crushing. It wrecked my faith in journalism and its institutions. But a lot of my work on long COVID restored that faith a bit. The solace that many long haulers drew from my pieces gave me solace in return. It convinced me that there is still a point to this horrible work and a purpose to bearing witness to suffering and a reason to continue shouting into the abyss. Sometimes, even if just a little, the abyss does actually brighten. I don't want to sound self congratulatory. The long COVID crisis is far from resolved. Millions of people are still suffering with MECFS. Long haulers need more than just confirmation of their pain. They need well funded and well conducted research, social support, workplace accommodations, and cures. But there's a lot that we can do in journalism while we wait on and push towards those outcomes. There's a poet named Sean Thomas Doherty who wrote a poem called Why Bother? It goes like this: because right now there is someone out there with a wound in the exact shape of your words. Those words are those words are our those words are ours to provide. Those wounds ours to plaster. Contrary to the widespread notion that speaking truth to power means being antagonistic and cold, journalists can instead act as a caretaking profession, one that soothes and nurtures. And we are among the only professions who can do that at a scale commensurate with the scope of the crises before us. We can make people who feel invisible feel seen, and we can make everyone else look. The last thing I'll say is that for me, all of this started because I said yes to a random friend date and then listened. Do not underestimate the power of small acts of kindness or little moments of connection and of stories. None of my pieces would have been possible had the long haul community not spoken up for itself. I don't think I would have understood what was happening or drawn connections to Emmy if I hadn't read Sarah's book or hadn't seen conversations between her and other people in the MECFS community or hadn't followed a lot of disability scholars on Twitter. Their work allowed me to do my work in many, many ways. When I first started covering long COVID, Eliza Perego had already coined the term. Amy Watson had coined long haulers. I can't tell you how useful this was to a journalist. There were names for the thing that I was writing about and the people who have it, and they were simple, evocative names. The Patient Led Research Collaborative had already done research that asked a ton of interesting questions while they were all sick. People from the ME community were explicitly drawing connections between long COVID and ME. ME advocates have been loud enough for long enough that even though I didn't know much about the condition, I did know about the work of people like Julie Rehmeyer and David Tuller. When I started diving into the topic, I found it incredible that MEpedia existed, a font of useful information in a space that can be utterly bewildering to newcomers. I found so many knowledgeable people who patiently explained the ins and outs of MECFS to me. People like Jen Breyer and Jamie Seltzer and Alison Sobrana. They told me about the controversies, the history, the sticking points. This was all invaluable. I also wrote this piece about people who were grieving loved ones lost to COVID. And for that piece, I spoke to an anthropologist named Sarah Wagner, who told me that after atrocities, wars, and conflicts, it is often bereaved family members who have to fight for recognition and reconciliation, despite the heavy burden that they already bear. When it isn't politically expedient for those in positions of power to commemorate the deaths and extend forms of reparation, Wagner told me, it falls on the families. And that's what I see here. All of my work draws from the efforts of people who had no energy to spare and were heroically using that little energy to advocate for themselves, to tell their own stories. I hope that you continue to do so. I hope the journalists in the room continue to believe you. Thank you very much. Take good care.